Hello, this is Dan Richardson at the Chapel of the North Hills, inviting you to our online worship experience. We're glad that you have chosen to worship with us today, and we're going to pose a question to you. I know you've heard this question. Perhaps you've even said this question. It goes like this: where was God in the middle of fill in the blank? Where was God when whatever. Where was God when my parents died? Where was my God in the plane crash? Where was God in the tornado? Where was God in the flood? And so the question comes a lot when we see a tragedy in the world, when we see hardship in the world, we want to know, where was God? And we often ask that, and it is often used in an accusing way of God. Well, we understand when we read the Bible that God is always present and God is our provider. God is the one who takes care of us, and when we live as God's children, when we make a commitment to Christ, we can totally trust that He is going to provide for us in many different ways. God's providence takes His first step toward us when we realize we need God. So let me say that a little differently. God's providence is first evidence in our life when we realize we need God. So that's where we start our story of the Exodus. We're looking today at the book of Exodus. We begin a trip through the Bible, the story of Exodus, and I think we're going to find some fantastic things in there that really apply to our modern world today. In the Old Testament, there was no greater miracle than the Exodus, when God took His people out of Egypt and put them into the Promised Land. This becomes the way that God identifies Himself throughout the Old Testament. And so it's kind of like the cross for the New Testament. This is the way that all the nation remembered God. And from then on, when God would come down and talk with people, He would remind them who He was. I am the God who called you up out of the land of Egypt, who brought you out of the land. I'm the God who gave you into the Promised Land. And so this is the foundational miracle of salvation for the Old Testament. And it really sets the stage for what Jesus did in the New Testament. These stories here are just fundamental to who Christ was and how He takes care of us. So, as we look at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we see tragedy. We see a nation who has become so degraded within its society that it was eventually enslaved, and bitterly so. And the people were crying out to God and were wondering, where is God in all of this? Didn't we have a God who promised to take care of us? Well, and that really sets the stage, because we're going to see that God has already been on the scene. God leads us all the way. Let me share with you a fantastic hymn of the faith. All the way my Savior leads me, what have I to ask beside? Can I doubt His tender mercy, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by faith in Him to dwell. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. Hello, we're presenting for the offertory music this morning, a beautiful hymn arrangement. What hymn is it that we're looking at today?
This is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, a traditional American melody.
All right, great.
Here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above.
So there is a question that I'm sure that you have heard. I'm sure you've heard this question. Perhaps Perhaps you've even asked this question. It goes like this. Where was God when and you could fill in the blank. Where was God in the middle of the blank? What would you fill in the blank with? A storm, hurricane. Where was God when the hurricane came and destroyed my house and flooded the city? Where was God in the midst of this tornado? Where was God when a tsunami came in and a wall of water wiped out an island? And we see a tragedy like that, and if we're not asking it, we're hearing it because they're asking it all around. What happened to God? How can God still be around whenever there's this thing going on? And we can think in big terms. Like here we are all over the world, people are living under the threat of this disease that is spreading everywhere. Every single country in the world is affected by this. Where is God in the middle of this pandemic? And we're asking these questions like this all the time. And I have to tell you, this is not only just a big question, this is a small question. It can come all the way down to not everybody in the world, but what about just me? Where is God when my family member got sick and died? Where was God when my children had a problem? And so we're always asking that on a big scale and on a small scale. Where is God in the middle of all of this? And I would say that is actually a really good question because you have the word God in there. And as soon as you ask that question, you're admitting that there is a God and we need it. So really the first step in realizing God's providence, that God has taken care of us, is to realize that we need God. And that's part of the answer, because God many times will allow us in this situation. He'll permit a situation just so that we can turn around and look up at Him. Just so that we will learn to depend upon Him, so that we can recognize our need of Him. That's the main thing that we have to have. That's where it starts. If we don't think we need God, then we will never understand the rest of His provision. We're going to start today looking in the book of Exodus, start through a sermon series in the book of Exodus. Been anxious to study this one for a long time because Exodus is the foundation, the foundational salvation story of the whole Old Testament. The entire Old Testament is kind of centered around God getting His people out of the wilderness and into the promised land. That's like the main focus of the whole Old Testament. And from then on, every time God comes down and talks to people, every time He is identified, He self-identifies as, I'm the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So He's always saying that because that's the big thing that they remember. That's the way the nation was saved in that sense of the word in the Old Testament. And we realize, of course, that is actually just pointing to the New Testament, pointing to the cross. And nowadays we look at the cross as the main thing. That's the absolute end of God's expression of love for us, is the cross. There's nothing more that can be said beyond the cross. And so the Exodus in the Old Testament is really just kind of pointing us forward so that we'll see Jesus when He shows up, and we'll recognize the God of the Old Testament in the life of Jesus and the work of Jesus. Well, we've got to set the stage here in a few of the scenes. As we look at the beginning of the book of Exodus in the first chapter, let's go back in the prehistory of Exodus, back to Genesis. The book of Genesis ends with the story of Jacob going down to Egypt. So Jacob and his whole family go down to Egypt because Joseph was a great man of God, and he is a type of Christ. He gets to kind of resemble Christ and in so many different ways that we're just kind of recognizing the life of Christ when it comes on because we've heard about these stories of Joseph and stuff. Joseph is sold into slavery in the Old Testament. Book of Genesis, he's sold into slavery not by somebody that conquered him, not by an enemy from another country. You remember who he was sold into? His brothers. That's right. 10 big brothers threw him into the pit. They were going to kill him. One of them said, Reuben says, no, let's don't kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. And so they sold him and told his dad that he had died. So he's down in Egypt and he's a slave. And that's a fantastic story of redemption, how God had used him in that process and actually elevated him to being the right-hand man of the Pharaoh. He was the king's right-hand man. Why? Because he was a godly man and God had his blessing all over him. And then he was able to use his position. Joseph was able to use his position to get his family there. All of the extended family came down and Joseph made room for them in Egypt. He actually gave them the best part of the whole country, the most fertile land in the whole country. That became for Joseph and his extended family. And all the tensions in the family, they were forgiven, and God blessed them in that time. And it says that the sons of Israel, in verse 7, were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied. They became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Okay, that's a blessing. Being fruitful and multiplying was actually part of the blessing that God gave to people. When he made people in the first place, he told them, be fruitful and multiply. That was his blessing to people. And so when that family got down there, 70 people began to multiply and have kids and have big families and be fruitful and gain. And they grew into a great people there. And the land was filled with them because of the blessing. Remember, God had told Abraham that he was going to bless him. And he said, I'm going to bless everybody that blesses you. And I'm also going to curse everybody that curses you. That's what his promise to Abraham was. So, here he is fulfilling all of that because now the family was down in Egypt and they were being fruitful and multiplying. All right, that's scene one, end of scene one. Let's go on to scene two. Egypt was involved in lots of building projects. There was construction going on all the time, building things, and they needed more people to work in these projects. And it was an economically bountiful country. Lots of things were going on. And when the rest of the world was running out of food and water, Egypt always had food and water, so people began to go down to Egypt. Okay? People began to migrate down to Egypt. Foreigners migrated down looking for work and getting involved in these building projects. Well, and eventually, the government of Egypt kind of got weaker. And so all these foreigners kind of had to make their own government. Okay? They set up their own little kingdoms and little city-states. And, it got more and more shifted until the foreigners were in charge of the country. That was a group of people called the Hyksos. And they were now running the country. And the native Egyptians, they were kind of put on the outs. And they didn't like it so much. But there was nothing they could do with it. They weren't strong enough. Well, there was a leader that came along, and he wasn't in the main capital city. He was in a different city called Thebes. And he decided enough is enough. We're going to get all these foreigners out. And so he rallied his forces and he started a war to try to drive out all of these foreign overlords. That's the Hyksos. Going to drive them out. And he made a war on them, but he was not successful. Wasn't able to drive them out. They were too strong. But that kind of emboldened his kids. You know how losing a battle can really make everybody else get stronger and more resolved to fight harder? Okay? We know all about that here in Texas, right? Remember the Alamo? Yeah? Remember the Alamo? We actually, we lost the Alamo. The Alamo was a losing battle for the freedom fighters in Texas, and they lost it, and that became the battle cry for the next one, and they won big there. So the Egyptians here were emboldened because they had lost that battle, and these two brothers, they just took on. They took off. Their names were Kamos and Amos. Okay? Does those names sound a little familiar? Kamos and Amos. Okay, so that's going to become part of a family name, and they drove out the Hyksos and set up a new kingdom. Now the capital was in Thebes, and Amos was the first of this new dynasty. And for generations, they used M-O-S-E in their names. His name was Amos, and he named another one of his sons Thutmose, like that. So it became kind of a family royal name. And he established this new dynasty. And that's what happened in verse 8. A new king arose who did not know Joseph. See, Joseph had a privileged status, right? He was the right-hand man of the king. And so all of his people that had come in, they were kind of in good standing. And they were appreciated, and they were respected around the country. But now there's a new dynasty. Things may not go so well for Joseph's family, for the Israelites. They didn't know anything about Joseph. One of the things Egypt always did, they were in a habit of doing this. They liked to change history. So they would go by and, they would carve pictures in the walls. And if they realized later they didn't like a leader, they would start scratching his pictures off the walls. They would start tearing things down that had any reminders that there was this king named whatever. So they would tear things down just so they would not think about that anymore. And they were beginning to tear down all these records that there was a group of people named that Joseph brought in, and they were good guys. Well, so they were kicking out all the foreigners, right? All of a sudden, they look around, and there's all these Israelites, and there's a lot of them. Hey, aren't these foreigners too? Yes, these are foreigners too. And so the mood begins to shift, right? The new king arose, and they didn't know Joseph and his family. So the mood is shifting, and now they look around and see all these foreigners, and they said, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are mightier than we." This is verse 9 now. "Let's deal wisely with them, otherwise they're going to multiply, and if there's a war, they're going to take the other guy's side. They're going to war against those who hate us, and they will depart from the land." And so they set taskmasters to afflict them with hard labor. They built storage, and they made them build these storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. The more they afflicted them, though, the more they multiplied. So all of a sudden, the xenophobia of the country and the fear of these foreigners and the racism and the mood of the whole country shifted overnight until now Israelites are not respected. They're no longer safe. They're no longer secure. Now they're considered a threat. Do you know that continues to happen? That's because in Genesis 3:15, God told the serpent, eventually there's going to be a Savior, and he's going to be born of this woman, and he is going to crush you. He's going to crush your head. So that promise that Jesus is coming, and he's going to come through that line, has always been known by Satan. And so ever since then, Satan has been trying to kill the Israelites. He's been trying to wipe them out ever since Genesis 3:15. He has been the enemy of the Israelites forever. This continued all the way through the Old Testament. In fact, if you think about the droughts and the famines, and every time that the Promised Land was running out of food and they had to go somewhere else, those were all attempts by Satan to destroy the Israelites. And right here, he begins to use this mood against Israelites to drive them into slavery and then force them into subjection, and his goal is eventually to wipe them out. We see it played out again later with Haman in the book of Esther. We see it played out throughout the Old Testament. We see it actually moving all the way to the New Testament. Remember, there was a king that decided, nobody else gets to be king, I'm just going to kill all the Israelite boys. That was Herod. That's how the New Testament starts. Another attempt for Satan to destroy the seed of the woman that's going to save the world. Okay? That's the image actually all the way at the end, when there's the serpent that's trying to devour the seed of the woman in the book of Revelation. Okay? It's all connected. And he was not able to stop Jesus being born. And he continues to go against the nation of Israel to try to destroy the plans for the second coming. He is still an enemy of Israel. And the mood can change like that overnight. There's an event in history, and it's not too long ago in history. This was 1938. My father-in-law was a year old. Okay, so that's just one generation back, 1938, November the 9th and 10th. The mood shifted in the country of Germany against Jews, just like that. The Nazi Party had taken control of the country, and in that evening, they went around rioting and looting and arresting people just for the crime of being Jewish. Okay? And Jews lived in every country in the world by then, because there was no nation of Israel. This is 1938. And that event is known today, still in history, as the Night of the Broken Glass, when the riots and the violent turned violent against the nation of Israel, and that skirmish eventually spread through the whole world. It's what we grew up calling World War II. Okay? It covered the whole world because of that. And it's all part of Satan's plan to destroy God's people. Okay? You know what John 10 tells us? That there is a thief, and he comes to kill and destroy. And that enemy is still after us. Because now we're part of God's people, and so we face that same threat. That's why Jesus told us, don't be afraid that people are going to persecute you just because you're Christians. If you are persecuted for righteousness' sake, congratulations. Or he says it, blessed are you who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. You will be called sons of God. See? We all face that threat right now, and we're wondering in these times, so where is God? Where is God when all of this is happening? Where is God in the middle of this tragedy that the enemy seems to be gaining so much ground? This tragedy in our life, the events of World War II, the events of the birth of Christ, and the events all the way back here where the nation of Israel The people of Israel were being enslaved. Where is God in the middle of all this? Well, you remember what I said? The providence of God is first seen when we realize our need for God. We've got to realize we need God. Okay? So, once we realize we need God, we can remember God is actually at work. God is actually on the scene. Okay, I'm going to flip back just a few pages toward the end of Genesis. Genesis 46. Okay, you can keep your thumb in Exodus 1 and just look back here at 46. Jacob was not so keen on going down. He was worried about going down to Egypt. This is going to be a hard trip for him. He was quite an old man and kind of scary about traveling into a new country. And God comes to him, 46:3 says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, because I'm going to make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt. So where is God? He's with him. He's with him. He said he was going to be with him. I will bring you up again also. Joseph will close your eyes. So you're going to go down there. You'll see your son. He will be able to bury you, is what he's saying. And I'm going to eventually bring the family back up. So that question, where is God in all that trouble? And we realize we need God. We next realize God is already here. God's already here and God's already on the job. He's working a big plan. He's got a plan that spans a long, long time. So 400 years before they needed, that they called out to God, God had already promised, I'm going to be with you and I'm going to get you through it. God's working a big plan. So whenever that stuff happens in our life, we got to worry and we got to wonder, where is God? Always remember, God's working a big plan. God's working a long time plan here, and He's on the job. He says, don't worry, I'm going to be with you. Does God give us any kind of promise like that in the modern times? Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the earth, to the end of the age. God is with us. He's promised to be with us all the time, forever. As long as we're here, God is going to be with us. Well, the king of Egypt, then, after this, in verse 15, he spoke to the midwives, and he tells them, whenever you see a boy being born, you've got to kill it. That's what his instructions here were. One of them was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And I love what it says here. The midwives, verse 17, the midwives feared God. Isn't that great? Midwives feared God. They didn't do what the king of Egypt had commanded them, and they let the boys live. So here are these guys. They believe in God. These two ladies, and because of their reverence for God, they were not going to kill babies, because they realized the king was asking something that was against God. And when that happens, whenever it's king versus God, you got to go with God. Okay? There is a time to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's with that coin. See who's on the head of the coin. But there's also a time to say, like the apostles, whether you beat us or not, we're not going to quit telling about Jesus, because God told us to. So you can throw us in prison or you can let us go, but we are going to continue to tell about Jesus. And so that's what these women did. You know, they disobeyed the king. You know what penalty that might have incurred? The death penalty. Okay? They didn't have like a statute, all right, this will give you 3 years in prison. No, it was, you do what I say or you're dead. So they were taking their lives into their own hands by disobeying the king. But I really want you to notice their names. These are some people that we get to know the names of, Shiphrah and Puah. Now these names are really nice. I've never met anybody named Puah or Shiphrah, but I should, because these are beautiful names. One of them, Shiphrah, means beautiful, and Puah means lovely little girl. So these are beautiful names, aren't they? And so they were honored and revered. Look what they came up to Pharaoh and they said, "No, we're not going to do it. The women are vigorous; they give birth before we get there." And God honored them. God was good to the midwives, right? You remember, tells Abraham, "I'm going to bless those that bless you and curse those who curse you." And we also discovered that being fruitful and multiplying is part of the blessing of God. Children are a blessing of God. You see that? Babies are a blessing of God. And when Pharaoh was trying to kill the babies, what's that? That's the opposite of a blessing, isn't it? He's trying to curse the Israelites. So he is going to get cursed. And those that honored God are going to get blessed. God was good to the midwives. They multiplied, they became very mighty. Because of the midwives feared God, look what happens to them in 21. They get families. They are given families. And so the first chapter of Exodus comes to a close with the story of the faithful Hebrew midwives and their beautiful names and their reward from God with beautiful families. And we wonder, we have their names, Shiphrah and Puah, and we of course know Moses is coming down the line. We know his name. So who was the Pharaoh? What was the Pharaoh's name? We're not told the Pharaoh's name. And the reason that the Bible doesn't tell us the Pharaoh's name is the Pharaoh's name is not that important. It makes no difference to the story because the Pharaoh was a person who was rejecting God's authority. And these Hebrew midwives were honoring God with their choice. So takeaway number one, Pharaoh's a nobody. We can do some research and we can make pretty good estimates on who we think that Pharaoh was. But ultimately, it makes no difference to the story. The story is about what God is doing. Remember, God's on the throne and God is on the job. The second one of these takeaways that I need you to remember is we're going to be faced with a situation like those midwives at some point. You're going to have to decide, ultimately, who do you give allegiance to? Ultimately, who are you going to stand for? Are you going to stand for the Pharaoh, the king, or are you going to stand for God? And when it comes to the point where you have to make a decision on what is the most important thing in your life, I urge you to put God on the top of that list. Say, we will honor God, because what was promised to Abraham is true as God's promise to us. When we honor God, God will honor us. Thank you for being part of our worship service this morning and part of our Chapel of the North Hills family. God bless you.